listening to the CPHGates. Mainstream media is dead, so long live independent media. I founded the CPHGates this year, January 2022, as an alternative means of getting your information. It's seen as a guide to a new paradigm of human experience. It has a lot to do with COVID-19 and the events that have unfolded in the past 2 years. We have a newspaper in Denmark that it's called BT. They wrote an article this month, January, at the start of this month, where they pronounced they had failed in their response, in their apparent duties to inform the people of Denmark about what was going on with COVID-19. There was like a list of topics which I would like to get through, which you can find over here. And one of the main points was that they apologized for just giving information without asking any questions directly from the government to their audience. So when I first heard about this article, when I first heard about the conference in my country, where my government pronounced they had failed, I didn't know what to think. Like, maybe a bit of background story about where I come from in terms of COVID-19 is maybe apt at this point. I followed Shuchert Bhakti and a lot of these I'll call freedom fighters, people who stood up for liberties and fundamental rights. I listened to these people, Spelsvig, Michael Eden, former vice president of Pfizer. I listened to Robert Malone. He created the mRNA vaccine platform, which is used in the so-called vaccines. So when I heard that my government finally admitted they had failed their response because they had silenced any dissenting voices from reaching so-called mainstream media, I needed to go for a long walk in the forest because I didn't know how people who took the vaccine and didn't have my opinion, my views, how they were going to take this. I didn't know how people would react if they saw a big mainstream media outlet, BT, in this case, in Denmark, apologizing for not really asking critical questions. Because this is by design. This is quite obvious by design. The whole COVID-19 pandemic couldn't have happened if you didn't have mainstream media putting people in a state of fear. And what is really interesting, I think, we should make people ponder and stop to think and ask some questions, is in the UK, for instance, just to use them as an example, they have hired, their government has hired, in collaboration with the BBC, British Broadcasting Channel, something like that, which is the equivalent of our state-funded media here, Danish radio. They hired behavioral psychologists behind the scene to try to coerce people, or not coerce, persuade people into taking the vaccines. This should also make people stop to think, why would you hire psychologists to persuade people to take the vaccine? Wouldn't it be more important when it's rushed, it's under EUA, it's under emergency use authorization, and it still is. Also in the European Union, it's not the CDC, it's EMA, European Medical Agency, but it's still under emergency use authorization, under the guise that there was no other safe and effective medicine to treat COVID-19, even though it's the most treatable virus or illness you could possibly hope for. You can prepare your natural immune response with vitamin C, D, and zinc. And I would encourage you to look up Doris Cahill and Per Brandgaard in Denmark. He also is a sundhedsanalytics. He knows a lot about health, and he used to be an expert who would get on TV and they would use, but they didn't in this case, because he actually had a difference of opinion which did not align with the vaccine uptake, because this is all about people getting to take the vaccine, and that's why there's been so much pressure and persuasion, to put it in polite terms, from our governments around the world. And I hope it's obvious to you that that's a complete and blatant disregard from what's actually important with these vaccines. When they've been rushed, they may be the most you may think they're the most safe and effective vaccines ever, but they're still under emergency use authorization, which means that their protocols for safety has been shortened. Otherwise this wouldn't have been possible under the idea from mainstream media that there was no other prophylaxis. But there was hydroxychloroquine and there was ivermectin. That's not just a horse dewormer, as the mainstream media would like you to think. It's actually one of the most safe and effective prophylaxis or drugs out there. So what I would like to try to do is to try to paint a picture of the mainstream media, or put them in a different light, where you can see that they may not have your best interest at heart, which in this case would be vaccine safety and efficacy. And there's actually a lot of information that's out there at this point about a different picture entirely. And what we find ourselves in right now is two complete opposing fractions in almost every single country. So, and that's deliberate. That's something called divide and conquer. It's a very old technique devised by Machiavelli, and he used it for the prince. And it's basically divide and conquer your enemy. In this case, we are the enemy. We the people are the enemy of who? Of the people who are actually in control of this whole planned pandemic. It's been planned for decades in advance, and I would even make an argument that it's been planned for hundreds of years, actually. Yeah. So this was just an example, and if you don't want to use this independent media platform, if you don't think whatever I tell you makes a whole lot of sense, then the good thing about independent media is that there is this cooperative spirit. So instead of competition, the unhealthy form of competition, because there's still good aspects and good traits of competition, which would be that you hone your own skills and you could become better and better and better, and you evolve basically. But there's also negative aspects of competition, which is greed and a feeling of Untermenschen and Übermenschen, that you feel like you're better than someone else, which is what you're left with symbolically when you watch sports, for instance. And that's not a bad thing to say, but what independent media is great at is not competition, but cooperation. So this platform is also a way for you to springboard onto other independent media outlets or platforms. So I'll just mention a few. One of the so-called independent medias, or one of it was actually a documentary that really helped me out a lot at the start of the pandemic, was Planet Lockdown, and you can visit planetlockdown.com, and I would highly encourage you to just either watch the full documentary because it's out now, and go donate to them. They've done amazing work. They've done a host of great interviews, and I would like to just briefly here mention something that I found quite peculiar, which was I try to watch as many of the interviews as possible they have put up on their website, and a little bit as I scroll down, like a little bit further down on the list, I saw a very Danish-sounding name, which was Mads Pelsby, and he is. I think you would if you would put him in an area of expertise, it would be finance. He's a former investment banker, and he's a whistleblower. And what does he blow the whistle for? Well, the world banks and the central banks. And he is a great asset to have here in Denmark. And full disclosure, I'm part of his party, JFK 21. And why would I possibly tell you I'm part of a party and I have independent media? Well, because what we regard as parties, as political parties, is really more puppetry. It's more for show. So in our country, as well as the United States, for instance, the Republicans and Democrats, blue and red, it's controlled up. It's just completely controlled. And it's the same thing in my country. So anyone who thinks, well, I would strongly argue that if we had the opposite party, blue or red, in my country, we would still have the same response, because our government is doing talking points from someone else, and it's quite clear when you compare and you correlate what, for instance, Justin Trudeau talks about, what Macron in France talks about, what Angela Merkel talked about in Germany, and the other responses was completely the same. Within a few weeks of the preparedness response to this pandemic in 2020, it was completely the same response. And anyone, or any country rather, which didn't fall in line, so to speak, was reprimanded. So one example of that is Sweden. They got a lot of flack for not doing as all other countries did, and in the end they were forced to do the same thing. So yeah. What more can I talk about? Well, this is just for a test, so I can see how it looks like, and if I can actually pull up information, like on the side here, and also to see if this light makes me look like I'm someone, like a Walking Dead or something. So to get back to the story, there are so many people, freedom fighters, freedom-loving people in my country, which I had never heard about. So many competent people I've never heard about. Why in God's name wouldn't they want to invite someone like Mads Pelsby on in Danish radio? He's one of the most competent people, I would even venture to say, on the face of the planet Earth, and talk about central banks, because he has personal experience with talking with these people. Like why wouldn't you want to invite him in and entertain a discussion with him? And I think I have an answer, kind of an answer, which is that you cannot control him in a debate, which is what this requires a lot. So one of the reasons why, if you haven't been acquainted with Thomas Sowell, he's an economist and intellectual from the Hoover Institute. In the 80s, Thomas Sowell was like sort of allowed on TV to do interviews, but it was very quick and very apparent that the political and economic paradigms they were struggling with back in their time, well, he was very hard to control, because he wouldn't get in line with everyone else. He said he would think out loud, and he would reach different conclusions, which is kind of annoying if one of your purposes of media is to get a sort of a focused message out there, and you don't want people who's going to tell you, actually, I disagree with this point, or that point, or this, that, or the other. It's kind of annoying, right? Because then what are you left with? Well, you're not left with a message, you're left with a debate where people can think for themselves. And if you're trying to make people reach a certain conclusion, then you can't have people who can actually think for themselves too much, if I'm being brutally honest, on TV. And that's the reason why Thomas Sowell was sort of like informally uninvited to do interviews on mainstream media, because he's a fierce intellectual. He knows a lot about economics, and sort of in the same line of thinking, I think the reason why you don't want to have someone like Maspelsky on and talk with him is because he's completely, you're unable to control him, right? He smells that immediately, and he will tell you, no, for instance, our national bank doesn't actually produce our money in my country. They don't. I mean, that was kind of a shocker. The people who creates money and thereby decides who the inflation and deflation are the central banks of the world, and they all in these central banks hold private interests. So now you must ask yourself, because this is really, it's an easy thing to say, but it's really hard to get it to seep through your brain and to manifest itself. But think about it. Think about that. Private interests decide the input and output, the flow of money creation in the hands of private people. And I would say 13 families or something that runs the world. It's a very small group, and you're not invited, as George Carlin would say. He's a very great comedian. So if you're interested at all about that discussion, I would invite you to join and watch that interview with Maspelsky. He's done a lot of interviews, and he also did some calculations, which I'll not go into. I will let him talk about that. Did some calculations about what would our country here in my country, Denmark, what would that look like if we actually created our own money, if our national banks actually did what they were supposed to do, what the majority of people here think they do, which is to create money. And if they actually did that, then you would actually have something called a citizen dividend, not a paycheck from the government, which requires restraints, or where government can put restraints on your paycheck, but dividend, the money that is actually yours. It's created in our name, and it's our money, it's our wealth, our energy,